Wait for this little thing to start. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. It is Thursday, August 12th. This is Microsoft Office Hours. I am Heather Cox. With me today is
Stephanie Stevens,
Victoria Dean,
and Garrett Chandler.
And we are so excited to have our colleague Corey Lee with us, who's going to be talking to us about some security. And thank goodness, because I know I am going to learn a lot. You guys all probably got my encrypted email. And so maybe I need to learn a few more things here. So Corey, we're going to turn our videos off and our mics and give the floor to you.
Awesome. Thanks a lot. And hopefully you can hear me okay. So today's conversation, we'll be using the next, I'd say, 15 minutes or so to quickly run through a presentation I put together called Securing M365 with Sentinel. So we'll talk a little bit about what Sentinel is, just to make sure that we're level setting here. We'll also talk about some of the goals and objectives for a solution like Azure Sentinel, and then hop into some of the scenarios that we see where Azure Sentinel can be used to monitor the M365 environment, and then wrap up with how to get started with something that we call free ingest, which is a scenario where you can light up Azure Sentinel in your environment, take advantage of the capability, free of charge for a number of scenarios that revolve around services that you may use from the Microsoft security um, capabilities. So with that, we'll hop straight in here, and we tend to start off with just a high level view on why there's an increasing need for expanded visibility across an environment, specifically environments that one are very cloud centric, or environments that use a heavy dose of BYOD devices, or just simply those environments that are going through some form of digital transformation and leveraging hybrid cloud, multi-cloud, and SaaS applications, and data is moving between on-prem and the cloud. This expanding digital estate conversation where we have lots of different entities interacting with resources and applications and services within our environments that require us to actually get more visibility, and not just get more visibility, but get visibility that can then be used to take action to help respond to things like emerging threats or cyber attacks. So, we as we talk about this Sentinel conversation, you'll see a common thread between what we refer to when we say getting enterprise-wide visibility across the organization, and automating response being some of the key core value elements of Azure Sentinel. With Microsoft 365, that expanded digital estate and the just sheer amount of data and information that's being collected, sanitized, analyzed by things like the Microsoft Security Threat Intelligence Graph, or various services if you're an M365 A5 customer that uses capabilities like Defender for Office or Defender for Endpoint, um, and various services that fit into that bucket, where those services are performing some form of analysis over activities that are happening, over potential threats that are being identified. And this expanded signal just continues to exacerbate an existing problem where the threat landscape and the overall attack surface for most environments has been expanding. And the amount of data that needs to now be analyzed and collected and sift through to actually make sense of potential security incidents is just daunting. So, one of the problems that was set out to be addressed when Azure Sentinel was developed, which will happen to here shortly, is to start to bridge that gap, make it easier to gain access to some of that signal and information that's being analyzed, and then be able to make sense of that information in a way that allows action to be taken. So we'll talk a little about SOAR here, but before that, I just wanted to highlight something that we refer to as SOC goals, or Security Operations Center goals. And this is true for most organizations, but especially true in education, in the sense that many security teams in education are very, very light, whether it's K through 12 or a higher ed institution. There are a few individuals on the security team. Oftentimes, there are folks on the security team that could also be junior resources or resources that just graduated from the institution. And they're tasked with having to sift through a lot of that data we talked about earlier and make sense of it. And while making sense of it, continuing to keep up with the changing landscape within the environment. More cloud services being deployed, more data moving out to things like OneDrive or other external third-party data sources and so forth. Um, Such that this conversation around reducing alert fatigue becomes extremely critical, and critical because we need for the lion's share and the majority of security teams to actually be able to see the things that are most critical uh, and respond to them in a timely manner. However, we know that today, just traditional, securities, let's just say operational workflows or the way in which theme solutions, security incident and event management solutions were used in the past, where they were primarily used to just aggregate a bunch of logs, lots of data. Let's just pull all the data together and we'll figure out what to do with it after the fact. But we're getting to the point now where we actually need to infuse more intelligence and more analytics into that alert management process so that we can bubble up the most important insights and ensure that response actions are taken with a degree of urgency depending on the impact of said alert. In addition to that, as we described earlier, just that expanding landscape, needing to be able to improve threat detection. In Microsoft, we have anywhere between 3,500 to 4,000 security professionals that are actively working on tracking things like nation state activity, tracking national or worldwide botnets, and looking to take down, let's just say, very, very common and well used techniques and tactics that are leveraged by attackers today. One of the things that was really at the core of the development of Azure Sentinel was being able to fuse a lot of that intelligence and a lot of that information gathering that Microsoft has access to into a product that would allow our customers to also receive that same benefit, ultimately redressing scenarios around advanced threat detection, both for what I'd consider to say are known scenarios as well as those that are unknown or fairly fresh out in the landscape. And then lastly, this concept of expanding SOAR capabilities or security orchestration and automation and response, where we're finding that it's not enough to just see blinking lights and see alerts and in some cases wait 24 hours or wait 2 weeks to respond to those types of scenarios that could be highly critical, that we start to leverage more automation for specifically for scenarios that we know are high risk and that we know that in many cases can cause a tremendous amount of impact or what we consider to say is catastrophic impact in the environment, thinking of things like the different stages of attack that take place with respect to attacks like advanced ransomware, where there's a human on the other end of a joystick, if you will, controlling activities within an environment, almost maneuvering through the environment as if they're maneuvering through a maze, and taking very deliberate actions within the environment as a means to not just increase the likelihood that a ransom payment is made, but to also do things like steal data from the environment to ensure that ransomware protection or ransom payment protection can be instantiated there. So expanding some of those automation capabilities definitely at the core of Azure Sentinel and ensuring that many of our SOC teams or security teams in education can start to use more automation to improve response times. And when you think about how Azure Sentinel just folds into some of the Microsoft security capabilities, a lot of customers will say things such as, Microsoft, you have so many different technologies and so many different security tools. We're not exactly sure what to use for which purpose. You can really think of Azure Sentinel as being an overlay for Microsoft security tools in earnest, but also security visibility and monitoring an environment all up. So as you think of how things like Microsoft 365 Defender, which we consider one of our extended detection and response solutions for productivity and collaboration scenarios, both in the cloud as well as on premises. How a lot of that information from those capabilities need to be able to feed in to a platform like Azure Sentinel to ensure that it's aware of what's going on in many of those scenarios, whether it's external users accessing documents or it's remote users that are accessing applications that are made available to them, being able to track all of those scenarios back to not just an originating source, but all of the actions that may be taken along the way. And the same with I would say, the brother capability to Microsoft 365 Azure Defender, which really covers down on infrastructure and platform cloud. So same deal, being able to get that telemetry into Azure Sentinel as a means to ensure that it's aware of what's going on across the infrastructure and platform space, to once again make sure that there's that cross-domain visibility within the environment where action can be taken when necessary. So at its core, Sentinel is an end-to-end cloud-native SIEM source solution. It doesn't just collect data. It's able to collect data to ensure that visibility is there. Also able to apply analytics in the form of rules to many of the data that's collected. So when it comes to most traditional SIEMs, there's a lot of work that goes into really normalizing data, collecting the data, and figuring out how to make sense of the data that we really make easy with Azure Sentinel via those analytics capabilities and some of the analytics engines that we use. But in addition to that, we also customers to get more proactive with going out and looking for threats, using things like our advanced hunting capabilities inside of Azure Sentinel that allow you to use many out-of-the-box threat hunting queries that can run against on-premises infrastructure, against cloud services, and start to highlight and answer some of those questions that may be asked in a scenario where something like Hafnium and the Exchange vulnerability takes place, or something like SolarWinds takes place, and you really want to get a feel for what is our exposure today, what is our, do we have any existing access that maybe shows some behavior that exhibits some of the indicators of compromise that are associated with an advanced attack. And take it a step further to be able to proactively look in that environment. But as we wrap up with just being able to take things like alerts across lots of different systems and then fuse them into what we call investigation timelines and create these containers that we call incidents, this is what really starts to allow us to take some of the workload off of security teams, do a lot of the heavy lifting regarding, evaluating how alerts correlate with one another or how they match certain criteria, and then start to bubble up some of the most important insights in the concepts of incidents to our customers. And then ideally, with most environments, getting to the point where we can take advantage of automation capabilities to, once again, not just see things happening in the environment, but if we see something like a leaked credential alert, that we generally know is very high fidelity and typically means that there's something bad, and we don't want to wait 24 hours to go and do something like block a user sign-in, that we can take that action with a decent amount of ease. So when we think about Sentinel all up, we like to say that it's a SOC as a service solution. And with that, there's a lot of capability that comes with it out of the box that really reduces the barrier to entry for most customers to use a SIEM solution. Generally speaking, a customer can get up and running with Azure Sentinel in 30 minutes to an hour, which we'll talk through free ingest here shortly, but start to take advantage of some of the capabilities like the out-of-the-box detections, capabilities like playbooks to automate responses, some of the automated hunting scenarios. In addition to that, there's a fair amount of learning, let's just say, opportunities that exist within inside of Azure Sentinel to help expose how different things inside of M365 work. So I'll point out one example being a most common scenario of when we're looking at things like authentication activity in traffic as it pertains to how a user authenticated to the environment. Oftentimes, most customers may not know that how long the logs for Azure Active Directory stay available. But in a case where organization is not storing those logs, the objective was to make it very easy for that organization to get those logs into something that could store that data for longer than 30 days, and then be able to make sense of a lot of the event codes as well as the activities that can take place at the Azure Active Directory level that could relate to cloud-based risks or modern stages of attack that could exist in environments. So a lot of out-of-the-box capability inside of Azure Sentinel, and the idea is really to ensure that it's augmenting the security team and helping improve in some of those areas that exist around automation, getting more intelligence, and ensuring that there's monitoring across the entire environment, inclusive of the cloud environment, which includes things like Azure Active Directory and M365. Some of the just general security use cases that we tend to see most common are monitoring Teams activity. What are our guest users doing inside of Teams, or what are our FTEs doing inside of Teams, and do we see common scenarios where there's data that's being accessed in the Teams environment that maybe is outside of the normal? Scenarios that involve credential theft, to include, do we have an identity that has been potentially password sprayed, and that identity now is taking some action within the environment that, generally speaking, is inconsistent with how that identity might normally behave. We've also seen some edge case scenarios around things like student activity monitoring, where some customers have found an issues case where they want to monitor things like are my students accessing cheating websites while they're taking a test, as an example, via a web browser. But I'd say one of the most common that we've seen as of late has been the scenario around detecting and stopping data exfiltration. As we've started to see many organizations move their files to OneDrive or to Box or Dropbox or to things like Azure Storage Blobs or Amazon Web Services S3 buckets, that the sprawl of where data exists within the environment has grown greatly. And the ability to know when certain types of data have left the environment, or when data has essentially been touched by individuals that are unauthorized to touch certain data sets, has increasingly become a scenario focus. So we've started to see an uptick around scenarios on that front. And lastly here, that I think are just more common in general, are some of the scenarios around privileged user monitoring. What are our global admins doing? Do we have global admins elevating if they have just in time to accounts that they really should no longer be authorized for? Or do we have potential administrative accounts that are technically service accounts in the cloud, like service principals or application registration objects, that are accessing resources or being assigned permissions that allow them to read all mailboxes within the environment and take the form of an alternate approach to doing things like creating mailbox rules to exfiltrate data. So we've seen an uptick around just being able to monitor those edge case identities and some of the scenarios that take place within the cloud control plane, specifically in Azure AD and M365, to really help identify some of those, once again, high risk or high impact scenarios. So as we talk about how most customers, as we get into, and hopefully this is fairly more visible to you than it is to me here, but this concept of a Sentinel Free Ingest, where you'll see this a chart that essentially shows where are the data types and the data sources that can be brought into Azure Sentinel for free. And free with essentially 90 days of log retention on top of the retention that may exist in the service itself that's creating those logs. Things like Azure Activity logs. So who's creating VMs in our environment? Things like the Office 365 Unified Audit Log, as we're looking at things like Office 365 Teams activity or Exchange activity or SharePoint. Those logs, which are super critical in scenarios where there may be some type of mailbox compromise, and we want to get a feel for, who touched items within our mailbox. For many of our AMC or academic medical center customers, we find that there are use cases where they need to be able to get down to the metadata level and see what was touched in a mailbox if they experienced a breach. And these types of scenarios are fairly common, but ensuring that we have those logs available and that the right logs are turned on, and ideally that they're accessible and able to be, let's just say, reasoned over, is super critical in the context of ensuring the protection of the M365 environment. I'll throw out a few additional ones there, but we'll just highlight here that for any customers using the M365 Defender capabilities, Defender for identity, for endpoint, for Office, etc., the ability to pull in those logs and the alerts that come from those services, specifically the alerts and the incidents, into Azure Sentinel for free, as a means to ensure that we're getting more coverage over those endpoints and those data sets that exist out at the edges. So a lot of value there that can be realized, but really trying to make sure that our customers are not losing sight of some of these log sources that, generally speaking, can go on, fly under the radar, and making sure that they're at least being tracked and monitored in some way, shape, or form. From an onboarding perspective, and I know we're wrapping up here. I think I have about 2 minutes left. We tend to recommend that customers treat Azure Sentinel as a phased onboarding solution, where we don't want customers to onboard to Azure Sentinel and treat it as a traditional SIEM where we just throw everything into the SIEM and we kind of creep back into some of the challenges uh, of history, if you will. But we really want to ensure that we're looking at this concept of core ingest and making sure the most valuable things are highlighted to customers and that they're brought into a SIEM, to ensure that the right actions can be taken, at least on the things that are most critical, especially if there are budget constraints and other scenarios that exist. And then move up the chain of phases to ensure that we're not just collecting data, but we're getting insights and we have benchmarks to allow us to get to automations that will, once again, help reduce the overall overhead that exists on the security team, and ensure that we're actually mitigating the threats that are most relevant. So we've produced something that we call a Sentinel onboarding plan, that really, we can work alongside of customers, free of charge, to talk with them about what are their goals, and highlight those use cases that are most common that we see, and ideally help them get to that core enablement stage where they're seeing a tremendous amount of their existing workloads phased into Azure Sentinel, starting with many of those free ingest scenarios that we talked about previously, and ensuring that we have coverage there, and then rolling out to more advanced things that, generally speaking, take some time and help with maturing the security team. But we oftentimes want to ensure that we're at least covering down on the basics and the foundational elements of what does it mean to ensure that we're getting the right visibility across our environment, and how can we respond to the most impactful events that may be taking place in our environments. And this tends to lead to conversations around what are some of the types of data that we should bring into things like Azure Sentinel, and why, and what's the relevance of them. So we've created some artifacts to really help with that conversation and talk about, for a given attack or for a given scenario, what are the right types of data to bring into the environment, and how do we ensure that we're getting insights via things like workbooks and reporting, or via some of the automations, to ensure that if we see something high risk, we can mitigate that risk and move pretty quickly to reduce impact. So I will stop there, and I know we got about 4 minutes left, but as I wrap up, one of the things that we like to cover in the context of Azure Sentinel is that when we're thinking about an attack, and we're thinking about how attackers behave, many of those attackers, they think in graphs. They don't think in linear lines. They're not always doing the same things twice. However, there are patterns to how many of the attacks, specifically, that are more modern, are executed. And those patterns tend to follow a certain process, regarding stages, if you will, where there's some form of an entry into the environment. There's, generally speaking, some form of a credential theft that's detected, and then ultimately some form of movement around the environment, potentially stealing other credentials and stealing some data, within the environment with the intent of doing something very, let's just say, damaging with that data, or launching something that could be on the worst case scenario, like a ransomware payload, and encrypting the environment to render the environment useless. So we do envision that our customers will get end-to-end visibility across the stages of attack that exist in most of those patterns within environments, and be able to not only see that activity is happening, but also respond to that activity, and ensure that attacks can't go from minimal impact to catastrophic impact where possible. So with that being said, this concludes my session for today. And if possible, I'd like to come back and maybe walk through a pretty awesome demo here to take this a step further regarding what we see with most investigation scenarios from a Sentinel perspective.
Well, I love a good demo, so I think that that's probably a good idea. Thank you so much, Corey, for that. Are there any questions from the audience? I didn't see any dropped into the chat. Anybody have any questions that you want to ask, or do you want to hang on to them and we can throw them at Corey during a demo session? Anybody want to come off of mute or drop anything in the chat?
I had a question. I went through the first couple of clicks of setting up the Azure Sentinel in our instance, and it looks like it's setting up some workspaces in West US 2. Is that free also, or do you pay the compute for those services?
So there is no charge for setting up the workspace. I will highlight, though, I mean, just depending on your region, you have the ability to choose a region that's obviously closely located to where you may reside. But for the free ingest scenarios, the creation of that workspace and connecting those free ingest connectors for the alerts and incidents, there's no charge. No charge for retention, no charge for ingest, and no charge for the creation of the workspace itself.
Okay, thank you.
Wonderful. All right.
Felt
well,
like a little bit of a Bob Barker moment. No charge, no charge, no charge. Awesome. It does look like we've got some questions around user insights, but I actually think it might be great to do a part 2, Corey, if you're game for it, to come back and do a demo and like maybe table some of these questions, because I think some of them may be answered in the instance and kind of look around at it. Yeah, Steven's saying that would work for him. So
okay,
if you're down.
Sounds great. And I did want to wrap up with one thing here. We do have a resource. It's something that we've seen. I just want to call out that there's a specific connector that I'll highlight, Microsoft 365 Defender, where we've seen some customers enable that connector, just speeding through the configuration and potentially go and check boxes within the deployment that can bring in data into Sentinel that's not free. So I'll drop a resource in the actual chat here for the community to use, but I wanted to call specific focus towards the Microsoft 365 Defender. For anyone configuring that connector, just want to ensure that you keep it in free ingest here if that's your intention, and don't enable the tables that are paid. As a means to ensure that you're able to phase into the Sentinel deployment. So I'll drop that particular link here in the chat now.
Great. Sounds good.
Perfect.
All right.
Well, thank you,
thanks
Corey.
appreciate you. And thanks everybody for staying with us and